There have long been rumors of unmarked graves at schools, and on May 27th, 2021, the remains of 200 children were found buried on the site of the Kamloops Residential School. According to Mary Ellen Turpin-Lafon, Director of the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was set up in 2008 to find out what happened in residential schools was told 50 deaths occurred at the Kamloops institution. She said massive ongoing problems with historical records, including those held by certain Catholic entities that they will not release, have made it very hard to understand accurately what happened. The discovery confirms what community survivors have said for years, that many children went to the school and never returned. Federal agents often moved children around, so it is possible some of those found are from other First Nation communities. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission said estimates of 4,100 children died at the schools based on death records, but has said that the true total is likely much higher. Large numbers of Indigenous children who were forcibly sent to residential schools never returned home. Archbishop J. Michael Miller of the Catholic Church, the Vancouver Archdiocese, said in a statement, "The pain that such news causes reminds us of our ongoing need to bring to light every tragic situation that occurred in residential schools run by the Church. The passage of time does not erase the suffering." In 2015, the Archbishop issued a letter repeating the Archdiocese's apology for the role the Church played in the federal government's residential school policy. But in 2018, Pope Francis rejected a direct appeal for an apology from the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. After carefully considering the request and an extensive dialogue with the bishops of Canada, he felt that he could not personally respond. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded in 2015 that residential schools were a program of cultural genocide. The use of Indigenous languages was banned at the schools, sometimes through the use of violence, as were Indigenous cultural practices. The Commission found evidence of neglect and maltreatment spanning decades at Kamloops. In 1918, a government official who inspected the school reported his suspicion that the vitality of the children is not sufficiently sustained from a lack of nutritious food. So far, 215 children, the graves of 215 children, were found at Kamloops Indian Residential School, at Maravel Indian Residential School by the Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan, east of Regina. 751 are unmarked graves in the Catholic cemetery near the former school. St. Eugene's Mission School near Cranbrook, BC, they found 182 unmarked graves using ground-penetrating radar. Which brings us to the topic today. Hi, our guest today is Roriki. Hi, Roriki. How are you?
Yeah, great, Walter. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, I'm happy that you're here, especially broadcasting out of the UK. That's good. The motherland, the mother country. Right? And
Perhaps.
And Dianne, yeah, we're here to talk about the residential schools. Thanks for showing up and coming on. Appreciate it.
Thanks for the invite. I always appreciate coming around.
Right. You want to get the story out there, that's for sure. So for people who didn't know, residential schools were a thing from the 1600s till 2000 and something, Dianne? I forget.
The last publicly funded one was 1997 and none of it, Rankin Inlet.
Right.
So that was the last publicly funded one.
Right. And in 1880, the federal government took over funding. Till they were over. You have family that were involved with residential schools, correct?
I certainly do. My mother, my grandparents, my mother, my uncles, cousins. Yeah. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think, could you tell us a little bit about what your mom went through, perhaps? Maybe that's closest to home.
Closest to home. Well, my mother and my uncles. When they took the children from the community of Takla, where I am right now, currently they would come down either via airplane, one of those little walks airplanes, I call them, they're little tiny little things. They would take the children in those planes, or they would take them by barge. My mother and her siblings went by barge, and that was an overnight trip. They would actually land on where my grandparents' house used to be. They used to land right in front of there, and they'd load up the children, and it would be an overnight barge trip from Takla landing to Fort St. James, where the Indian agent would come and collect them and take them to the Jack school.
These were 5 and 6 year olds, were they, or anybody who was?
They were all ages. They were young, like school age, and so if you were of age of school, you were going.
Yeah.
You were either going by the airplane or you're going by the barge.
Did the parents of these children, did they think this was a good thing, that they were going to get a good education and a positive, or?
The parents were told that if they did not release their child to attend the residential schools, they themselves would be jailed. And that was one of the things that my grandfather, he tried to fight to keep my mom and her siblings, and was told straight up that if you fight this, you will be going to jail.
So all these kids in the village are taken to an Indian agent and then brought to a school, or separated? Were they together at least, or?
No, what they did was they separated boys from girls, so all the siblings were all separated. You weren't allowed to talk in your mother tongue, so carrier, for us it would be carrier Indian. You weren't allowed to talk in your mother tongue. You weren't allowed to do anything, but the first thing that they did was they removed everything that was part of you. They would cut your hair, they would cut your hair, they would delouse you, because, we were back then, savages and unclean. Yeah, they would take you in, take all your belongings, everything that you took with you, and your clothing, everything, and delouse you, and you'd be separated into girls' dormitories and boys' dormitories. And you might have caught glimpses of your sibling from across the yard, but there was no interaction.
Right. What was, did your mom talk about her first night there at all?
My mom talks about it very little, because it does bring back a lot of trauma for her. And when she does talk about it, it is all in the third person. Everything happened to somebody else, not her. Yeah. But yeah, she was, you're a young child and you're taken away from your family. You don't know the language, because the only language you know is your mother tongue. Right. And you're now no longer allowed to speak it. You're a number, basically. And if you were to speak your language, you were beaten, abused. You're separated from your siblings, so you had no form of support.
I could not even imagine,
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't think
I couldn't imagine as an older child, never mind a young one.
Right. I don't think most Canadians could imagine it, or other people. Yeah. So she's in the school, and she had other siblings that she couldn't contact at the school. Is that correct? You weren't allowed to social interact with them. Right. Because that would just continue on your indigenous ways if you still had contact with your siblings, because you would probably talk to them in your language. You would probably do whatever ceremonies that you still did, right. And those were absolutely forbidden. They were taking away the social bonds. Yes. And the cultural identity of these children, right? Yeah, they were broken down and to be rebuilt in assimilation. Well, rebuild. I mean, once you come out of a school like that, there must be almost a PTSD, or? You see a lot of that, and a lot of it comes out in the behaviors when they return home, because when they return home, they are no longer, they're a stranger. My mom was a stranger when she came back to community. My grandparents had to reteach her language. They had to reteach her the cultural ways, and
to her friends and whatnot that she had prior to. They were all strangers to each other now.
Were they tagged as
So-
different, these children that returned home? You know,
Well-
not indigenous and not white? Are they
You're
caught in
an
the middle?
outsider when you come back.
Right.
Yeah. So
Right.
yeah.
And I know the answer to this, but the government didn't provide any funding for these children or anything to help them.
The schools were underfunded, and that's one of the reasons why the churches were the ones to take it over.
Right.
And the one that my mom the one that my mom was in was run by Catholic school, Catholic religion. There were other ones, whatever the dominant religion in the area, those were the ones that ran the school. Mm-hmm. So in my mom's case, it was Catholic, and they were all underfunded. The students had to work the land themselves for the foods and take care of whatever animals that they had there for. And the big thing to note there was even though those children took care of the harvest, the planting, the harvest, and all that, they didn't get to eat that.
Oh.
So they got the bare minimum just to keep them alive, but it wasn't the big meals that the priests and the teachers and the nuns had. Mm-hmm. The only time they would have those was when the Indian agent came and to inspect the school to make sure the students were being taken care of properly. That was the only time that they got to see those kinds of foods that they were actually the ones growing and creating.
Was your mom allowed to return home once in a while?
When she first left the school, she came home. But when she married my dad, she was not allowed to come home.
Well, I meant at Christmas time or something like that.
Oh,
sorry.
Only for Christmas breaks, the parents had to go and collect the children. They use their own money to collect the children, and that was considered a privilege to the families to have their kids home. And if the parents didn't have the money to collect the children or bring them back, even if they didn't bring them back on time, they would lose that privilege of having their child come home for any of the holidays.
Wow.
So she was able to, but still, it was a hardship to go pick up your child.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So. I can't imagine spending a couple of years in the school and then going home for Christmas. I mean, yeah. Especially at that young age, probably have no clue. Right?
So yeah, it's like I said, it's not something that she actually talks about. And when she does talk, it's the third person.
Right. I'll get back to that in a second. But when the graveyards and Kamloops were discovered, did you talk to your mom about that? How did she have flashbacks or anything or?
When they discovered those graves and when it started being advertised or shown on TV, she, like many other elders, became super quiet. They and you could see the trauma building up in their eyes again, and just by the actions. And she would be glued to the TV, but super quiet. She wouldn't talk about it, but she was super quiet. You could just see that it's all bringing back, because one of the things that my uncles used to talk about was that because the burials themselves and the bodies were not a surprise to us. I don't believe there's any Aboriginal in Canada that this came as a surprise to. The reason being is growing up, we would hear those stories about children having to bury their classmates, and that they'd have to dig the holes. My uncles were one of these small children that used to do that. They used to dig the holes and bury those children, and they sadly also had to dig them up when those bodies were moved. They don't know where they were moved to, but they so knowing that and knowing how this has brought up more trauma for them, it's quite devastating again. So
I can imagine. can imagine.
Yeah.
Roriki, if you have any questions, you go ahead, my friend.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to see you again, Dianne. We've had a couple of real great conversations before with the presentations that you do, and my interest in talking to you. I come from an Indigenous background as well, so similar sort of activities that you have these. Colonial, particularly Anglo-Saxon colonial governments, and they tend to have a similar attributes as far as the way they deal with Indigenous cultures. So I was really, obviously, in your heart you feel the pain of your peoples, but also there's the questions around how it's been done and how it's been continuously propagated as a state system of genocide. So, I'm looking at your experience as First Nations in Canada, and then that's transferable around the world. But it's also really interesting because, as opposed to perhaps your cousins in the United States, you're actually a more sizable proportion of the Canadian population, and you probably have a lot more, I wouldn't say political power, but you have a lot more ability to impact the broader sort of community in Canada now than you did, or that sort of American, US American, I should say, tribes have to influence their situation. So a lot of the things that I'm sort of wanting to talk to you about today is around that sort of system of where you are now, and post the suffering and the actual dealing with the problems that obviously this is 3-4 centuries of oppression, but where are you now? And I know you're doing quite a lot of work inside your own nation as far as creating that, but I also wanted to get a few ideas around where you're not only your particular First Nation, but Native Americans across Canada, or Native Canadians across Canada, can take forward, and what you need to do as a movement and as a political entity inside the nation of Canada. How can you sort of ensure that your culture isn't, the effectively these residential schools are part of a policy of genocide against your peoples. How can you, as a 50 or 100 different nations across Canada, how can you ensure that each of your cultures exist and continue to exist, and how can you grow and thrive in the future? Because I think that's something that is clear from all the information that's been coming out lately, but also the memory of your peoples is that you still exist. How do you make sure that goes forward?
Loaded question.
It's a very
Loaded question. Sorry, Dianne. Don't get to ask it often.
Maybe for the listeners
sit
at
up
home,
for this one.
I'll just remind them there was 150,000 First Nation Inuit and Métis children that attended these schools. So that was a lot of people through the years. And to your question about political power, Roriki, if it wasn't for the Indigenous vote, I don't think Justin Trudeau would have been Prime Minister.
Probably not.
Right.
I'm guessing.
So,
but
it's a great question, Dianne. I look forward to the answer, my dear.
I'm not even sure how to answer that. What I will start with is the genocide piece. I will start with that because one of the things, and this is very near and dear to me because it's actually happening to my grandkids right now, is the system that they put in place, the Indian Act, even with their recent revision, where my mother lost her status when she married my dad, who was a white man, my Caucasian. She was reinstated, which means that I was upgraded because what happened was the Indian blood stopped with me. And with her reinstatement and reassessment, the Indian blood now stops with my children. It doesn't carry on to my grandchildren. So they are still continuing on their genocide. Like my grandkids are not going to be considered status. They're not going to be considered Indians. They're going to be non-status. And so basically it stops with my children and anybody else who's in my situation. Now, any other culture, you have a long line of heritage. Like if you're Ukrainian, if you're practicing the Ukrainian way, they're not going to say you're not. But if you're First Nations or Aboriginal or Indigenous, whichever way you want to call us, regardless of whether you are practicing your cultural, your heritage, your traditions, there's that card that says that you're Indigenous, that you're Indian. And it stops at a certain point. So they are going to continue on with that genocide, whether we like it or not. So what can we do about that? It all depends on if you're a custom ban, you can bring in all these children and work around the custom adoption portion. But there aren't very many of those left. And so unless you continuously marry only Aboriginals, even if you're going to live the Aboriginal way, you're like your children, we are effectively going to die off eventually. So,
is this coming from the government or is it coming from the separate tribes or nations?
What
the rules about the blood?
Some back east do have the blood rule,
right,
where if you marry outside that community, like outside their race,
mm-hmm.
you're out, you're done. But the blood rule is federal government. So,
and did the federal government put that in as their criteria with treaties and via that way, or is it federal law that they can change?
They can change it. It's all part of the Indian Act, and they've revised the Indian Act to reinstate my mother. Like back in the day, they used to, if you were a Caucasian woman and you married a First Nation man, you would become status. Now, if you were a female Indigenous woman and you married a white guy or a Caucasian man, you lost your status. And that was my mom's case, and that's in the Indian Act itself. And then they revamped that Bill C-31, which gave the female Indigenous women back their status. But even though their children were lived the traditional ways and did the traditional cultural activities and stuff, everything stopped with them. And like I said, that's where I'm at right now, is my kids are with this Bill C-31. My kids can become status. My son actually is 34 years old, and he just became a status Indian because he wasn't allowed to before. But his daughter is not allowed. She won't be considered an Indian in any way, shape, or form unless they revamp that to acknowledge that she's First Nations as well.
Thoroughly patriarchal system.
Yes, it still is.
Right, and you would figure that would be changed, or could be changed, or should be changed.
In a world of equality that we preach equality and fairness. If you're a First Nation, that doesn't apply, in my opinion.
Yeah, it does seem that the federal government has not really. The revision seems to just be playing around on the corners. It doesn't seem to have actually gone back to the core principles of self-determination for your tribes and your nations. There's no it's still not showing any respect for your cultural traditions and also your cultural development. You know, like that's the whole point, isn't it? Is that it dies if there's no one to, you know, if there's no one to upkeep it.
Yeah, it still pits us together or against each other as well, because we're still us and them. Like, you know, when I was growing up, it was us and them. It was you either lived on the reserve or you didn't. If you didn't live on the reserve, you were not part of that community. And now, as an adult, it's still us and them, because now it's you're either status or you're not. And if you're not, you're not part of that community.
Yeah, and politically, internally inside the various First Nations, do you all have completely different governance internally?
Yes, some have. They're working on their self-governance. I can't even speak self-governance. Some are farther ahead than the rest, and some, like I said, the ones back east are able to make those band membership decisions. Who can get in, who doesn't, things like that. But for most of them, it's up to the federal government to decide. So,
do you have like do you have a? I know in New Zealand they have a sort of a department for Maori affairs or something like that. Do you have something similar in Canada for the federal and state government or province governments?
We have an Indian Affairs. First Nations out here, Indigenous people fall under federal government, so we fall under the federal government Indigenous or Indian Affairs. So,
and how do they interact with you as a status tribal clan member? Do you get to negotiate with how things happen, or do you just they just sort of read off the federal laws and say this is what you can do and this is what you can't do? It's more an enforcement agency.
It's right now it's more enforcement. Well, even with our child welfare, like we're working on towards taking back our child welfare, and that's a long process. Just that one part of it. So every part that we are doing, it's a fight. It's an uphill battle for everything. Like even our community needs to grow so that we can build houses on. We have to ask permission to grow that community line, the boundary lines for our community. So we can't just say, okay, we're gonna build a subdivision or something here. First of all, we have to ask for money. Then we have to, first part, we have to ask if we can actually move the boundary for the reserve. We have to ask for permission, and that itself takes forever. Then we have to ask for funds to build a house on that new section if we're granted that permission. And it's everything's an uphill battle.
Do you guys even, I mean, like from a perspective of the lands that you currently have been given as reserves, what sort of proportion of that is of your original sort of natural sort of tribal area? Is it like 2% or something like that, or is it?
That I don't know. We have trap lines in traditional territories all over the place, and in some cases they do overlap and stuff. But we don't. Before colonialism, we never did the that is mine, that is yours.
Yeah.
So when that started, that's when this is this is where my land starts and this is where it ends. We never did that. We walked amongst each other peacefully, and we respected when we went into someone else's territory. We would acknowledge them, and if we did any hunting on there, we would gift them with what's part of what we got. And now it's us and them again. Like we've been pitted against each other for years and centuries, and It's just
There's
for decades,
there's
forever.
quite a few of the treaties have not been sanctified. I don't know if that's the correct word, but the treaty where this nation owns this amount of land, and I think the Pacific Coast Link, the pipeline,
Oh,
where the hereditary chiefs were saying, okay, we're going to stop you till we get this treaty signed, and saying this is our land. There's quite a few treaties not, or
yeah.
land divisions.
Most of BC is not. British Columbia is not treaty.
Right.
Yeah, like I know my nation is not treaty. Treaty, we're in treaty negotiations, but we're not treaty. We haven't signed any treaties, and a lot of the communities, Indigenous communities out here in BC, have not signed them. And what's happening with the pipeline is the chiefs that were elected, certain chiefs in certain areas that were elected, signed agreements with the pipeline. What happened was the hereditary chiefs that, that the land that the pipelines are going to go through, that's their traditional territory. That's where they do their trapping, their livelihoods. They were not part of those signings, and that's where that conflict is coming from, because if they did not include the hereditary chiefs, and so that the hereditary chief stood up and said, no, we're not allowing this.
Is there conflict between the elected and the hereditary chiefs?
All the time. Because what happens is, like a regular business, because every community is a business, basically. Like their band office is a business, and it's going to be treated as such. And the reason for that is because of Indian affairs. You always had your Indian agent, and so now we have chief and council, stuff like that. You also have the land-based people, the traditional hereditary chiefs that live off the land, that are part of that's their land base. They're not elected, they're hereditary. And most of the time they're not even talked to, they're not even in part of the discussions. So the elected officials for the community are the ones that are making the decisions for the community and the traditional territory, but the hereditary chiefs are not part of that. So that's where you get your conflict.
It seems to me that it's getting more like the elected chiefs or the generation that comes up is being more like Canadian civilization now, or European civilization. They're losing their ability to interact with losing their indigenous or native style society, I think is a better term. Do you
Originally,
know what I mean? Becoming more capitalistic, that sort of thing. Though, so this map here, apparently, this is where they found graves of Indigenous children in Canada, and that is quite the map. And